At 4:47 a.m. on December 18, 1940, Corporal Alejandro Alex Mercado crouched in a shallow irrigation ditch 17 meters from the coastal road, watching 23 Japanese soldiers march through the pre-dawn mist rolling off Lingayen Gulf. In his right hand, he held what appeared to be half a coconut shell packed with scavenged gunpowder, rusty nails, and a fuse made from braided abaca fiber soaked in kerosene. The nearest Allied position, a guerrilla camp commanded by Captain Vicente Romero, sat 4 kilometers inland through dense jungle terrain that would take him 40 minutes to traverse if he ran without stopping. In approximately 90 seconds, the lead scout of the patrol would reach the bent acacia tree that marked the outer perimeter of the resistance supply cache, and if that happened, 3 months of carefully hidden American airdrops would be discovered, cataloged, and destroyed. This is the story of a man who became a legend, not because of his rank, his training, or his arsenal, but because he paid attention when everyone else looked away. The patrol moved with the rhythmic precision of a well-drilled unit. Their boots created a syncopated percussion against the packed earth of the road. Left, right, left, right. A sound that carried clearly across the open rice paddies despite the distance. Corporal Mercado could see the glint of bayonets catching the first pale light of dawn, could make out the outline of the officer leading from the front, a lieutenant by the look of his sword. The man carried himself with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance, no ambush, no threat whatsoever from this seemingly abandoned stretch of agricultural land. They had every reason to be confident. The Imperial Japanese Army had controlled this region of Luzon for nearly 2 years. Their patrols had grown routine, almost lazy, because the organized Filipino resistance had been systematically crushed in the months following the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. What remained were scattered bands of guerrillas, poorly armed, desperately undersupplied, more focused on survival than combat. The Japanese had learned to treat these coastal patrol routes as training exercises for fresh troops rotating through from Manila, a chance to acclimate to the heat, the terrain, the endless monotony of occupation duty. Mercado shifted his weight slightly, feeling the cold mud seep through the knees of his tattered khaki trousers. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. The coconut shell device felt absurdly light, almost comical in its crudeness. He had made dozens of these over the past 6 weeks, testing different ratios of powder to shrapnel, different fuse lengths, different shell thicknesses. The other guerrillas had watched with a mixture of amusement and pity. Even Captain Romero, who generally encouraged initiative, had quietly suggested that Mercado focus on more conventional preparations. But Mercado had noticed something during his months of observation. The Japanese patrols, despite their discipline, followed patterns. They reacted to threats with overwhelming force, but often struggled with situations that fell outside their tactical doctrine. A properly placed improvised device, something unexpected and unusual, could create confusion disproportionate to its actual destructive power. Confusion, in the right circumstances, could be more valuable than a dozen rifles. The question was whether his theory would hold when lives depended on it. The patrol drew closer. Mercado could now distinguish individual faces, young men, most of them, probably conscripts from rural prefectures sent to garrison duty in what the Empire considered a pacified territory. They talked among themselves, casual conversation that drifted across the paddy fields in fragments of Japanese he couldn't understand. One soldier laughed at something another had said. The lieutenant called out a command, probably reminding them to maintain proper spacing, and the line adjusted slightly. 60 meters to the cache. 50. 45. Mercado's fingers found the waterproof match he'd tucked into the band of his hat. He'd stolen it 3 weeks ago from a Japanese supply dump, one of a dozen small acts of petty theft that had slowly accumulated into something resembling a guerrilla arsenal. The match represented reliability. Unlike the friction strike methods he'd tried earlier, this would light on the first attempt or not at all. The eastern sky had begun to purple with the approaching sunrise. In another 20 minutes, the morning would arrive in full, and the tactical advantage of the pre-dawn darkness would evaporate. This was the worst possible time for an engagement. That transitional period when shadows played tricks and identification became guesswork. But Mercado wasn't planning an engagement. He was planning a demonstration. 35 meters to the cache. The lead scout, a thin man carrying his rifle at a relaxed angle, kicked at something in the road, probably a stone, and kept walking. Mercado had grown up in a fishing village 8 kilometers south of this position. His father had built boats, and Mercado had learned early the importance of understanding materials, of knowing exactly how much stress bamboo could take before it splintered, how to read the grain in a piece of wood, how to judge by weight whether a coconut was fresh or beginning to rot. These were not skills that translated obviously to military service, and indeed, when he joined the Philippine Commonwealth Army in 1940, his superiors had found little use for a skinny 22-year-old whose primary qualification was an intuitive understanding of tropical vegetation. The war had changed everything, of course. After the surrender, after the retreat into the hills, after the reorganization into guerrilla cells, suddenly everyone's skills mattered. The lawyer became the intelligence officer. The school teacher became the radio operator. The mechanic became the weapons specialist. And Mercado, the boat builder's son, had become the man who understood improvisation. 25 meters. The lieutenant raised his hand, and the patrol halted. Mercado's breath caught. Had they spotted something? Had some detail betrayed the cache's location? The guerrillas had been meticulous about camouflage, but this unit had been operating in the region for months. They knew the landscape, knew what belonged and what didn't. But the lieutenant was merely consulting a map, spreading it across the hood of an imaginary vehicle, squinting at it in the weak light. After a moment, he refolded the map, issued another command, and the patrol resumed its advance. 20 meters. Mercado struck the match. It flared bright in the dimness, and he immediately cupped his hand around it, shielding the light. The smell of sulfur stung his nostrils. He touched the flame to the abaca fuse, watched it catch, begin to smolder. The fuse would burn for approximately 8 seconds. He'd tested it 17 times to establish the average, though he knew variations in humidity and fiber density could alter the timing by plus or minus 2 seconds. He stood, using the movement to generate momentum, and threw. The coconut shell grenade arced through the air, tumbling end over end, trailing a thin streamer of smoke. For a moment, Mercado had the terrible certainty that he'd misjudged the distance, that the device would fall short or overshoot, land harmlessly in a paddy field, and fizzle out like a wet firecracker. But the trajectory held true. The shell landed in the middle of the road, 15 meters ahead of the lead scout, rolling slightly before coming to rest. The Japanese patrol saw it immediately. The lead scout shouted a warning, bringing his rifle up. The entire formation froze, every eye fixed on the smoking object in the road. The lieutenant barked orders, his voice sharp with sudden tension. They thought it was a mine. Mercado could see the calculation playing out across their faces. This was exactly the kind of improvised device the guerrillas would use, a pressured trigger mine camouflaged as roadside debris. The fact that it was already smoking suggested a burning fuse, which meant time delay, which meant someone had placed it recently, which meant the guerrillas were close. The lieutenant shouted it again, and the patrol scattered, soldiers diving into the drainage ditches on either side of the road, seeking cover from the anticipated blast. Their discipline held. They didn't panic, didn't run, but they abandoned their formation, their forward momentum, their confident advance. They transformed from a cohesive unit into 23 individuals focused entirely on personal survival. The grenade detonated. The explosion was not particularly large. Mercado had packed perhaps 60 grams of powder into the shell, enough to generate noise and shrapnel, but not enough to create a significant kill radius. The coconut shell fragmented into dozens of pieces, and the nails and scrap metal he'd packed around the powder charge became projectiles. But the effective lethal range was perhaps 3 meters at most. What mattered was the sound and the surprise. The crack of the explosion echoed across the rice paddies, sending flocks of egrets bursting from the fields in white clouds. The soldiers in the ditches pressed themselves flat, hands over their heads. One man screamed, not in pain, but in fear. Another soldier's rifle went off accidentally, a sharp report that added to the confusion. Mercado had already dropped back into his irrigation ditch and begun crawling north, moving parallel to the road but away from the patrol. He kept his head down, using the raised paddy berms as cover. Behind him, he could hear shouting in Japanese, the harsh syllables of officers trying to restore order, the confused responses of enlisted men trying to understand what had just happened. The patrol would assume an ambush. That was the tactical doctrine. An explosion meant enemy contact, meant suppressing fire, meant calling for support. They would spend the next several minutes securing the immediate area, checking for additional devices, trying to locate the source of the attack. Every second they spent doing that was a second. They weren't advancing toward the cache. Mercado counted to 60, then risked a glance back toward the road. The patrol had indeed gone into defensive mode. Soldiers crouched in the ditches, rifles pointed outward, scanning the paddy fields. The lieutenant stood in the middle of the road, sword drawn, shouting orders. 2 men approached the blast crater cautiously, examining the scattered debris. One of them picked up a piece of coconut shell, studied it, then showed it to his companion. Even from this distance, Mercado could see the moment of recognition, could imagine the confusion. A coconut shell? The guerrillas attacked them with a coconut shell? The lieutenant barked something, and one of the soldiers ran back down the road the way they'd come, probably to report the contact and request instructions. The rest of the patrol began a methodical sweep of the surrounding area, moving in pairs, checking every ditch and berm within 50 meters of the blast site. Mercado continued crawling north. He'd planned this route carefully, memorizing every fold in the terrain, every cluster of vegetation that might provide concealment. The morning light grew stronger, which worked against him. but the patrol's attention remained focused on the immediate vicinity of the explosion. They expected to find guerrillas nearby, probably in prepared positions, possibly with additional devices ready to deploy. They wouldn't expect a lone man armed with improvised explosives, already retreating, satisfied with the delay he'd achieved. By the time the sun cleared the horizon fully, Mercado had put 400 meters between himself and the road. He could still hear the Japanese patrol, their voices carrying across the fields, but they were no longer advancing. They had stopped completely, turned what should have been a routine march into a combat operation. They would probably remain in the area for another hour, at least, maybe two, securing the road and waiting for reinforcements or further orders. The cache was safe. Alejandro Mercado had never intended to become a soldier, much less a guerrilla fighter. He'd grown up expecting to inherit his father's boat-building business, a small operation that served the fishing families of Sual, a coastal town in Pangasinan province. The work suited him, precise but creative, physical but thoughtful. A good boat required understanding how different woods responded to stress, how to shape planks to maximize strength while minimizing weight, how to seal joints so they'd remain watertight through years of saltwater exposure. His father, Domingo, had taught him that observation mattered more than formal education. "Anyone can learn to saw in a straight line," the old man would say, running his calloused hand along a keel timber. But knowing which wood to choose, which piece has the grain that will hold the curve you need, that takes attention. You have to look, really look. And then you have to remember what you saw. Mercado had taken that lesson to heart. While other young men in Seoul focused on drinking, cockfighting, and chasing girls, he'd spent his evenings walking the beaches, examining driftwood, studying how the ocean shaped and weathered different materials. He learned to identify dozens of wood species by sight and touch, learned which shells made the best scrapers, learned how palm fiber could be processed into rope that would outlast anything available in the hardware stores in Dagupan City. These were humble skills, unremarkable in a fishing village, but they gave him a particular way of seeing the world as a collection of materials waiting to be understood and utilized. When the war came to the Philippines in December 1941, Mercado was 23 years old, unmarried, with no particular political convictions. He'd heard about the Japanese advance through Asia, of course, but it seemed distant, abstract, unrelated to the daily rhythm of his life. The Philippine Commonwealth Army had been recruiting, and his friends had debated whether to enlist, but Mercado had resisted. He had boats to build, orders to fill, a business to eventually inherit. The Japanese invasion changed that calculus overnight. Suddenly, the harbor at Seoul filled with warships flying the rising sun flag. Suddenly, Japanese officers commandeered the best houses in town. Suddenly, there were checkpoints, curfews, labor conscriptions. The boat-building business collapsed. The Japanese wanted boats, but they weren't interested in paying for them, and Domingo refused to work for free. Mercado enlisted in the Philippine Commonwealth Army in January 1942, more out of anger than patriotism. The recruitment officer, a harried captain from Manila, had glanced at his application and assigned him to a logistics unit. "You can do carpentry?" the officer had asked. "Good. We need someone who can build supply crates and repair wagons." It wasn't the heroic role, Mercado had half expected, but he'd accepted it. The army, he quickly discovered, ran on logistics more than bravery, moving supplies, maintaining equipment, building infrastructure. These were the unglamorous tasks that kept units functional. He'd been assigned to the 21st Division, stationed in central Luzon, and spent the first months of the war building defensive positions that everyone knew wouldn't hold. The fall of Bataan and Corregidor forced a rapid evolution. The 21st Division disintegrated, some units surrendering, others retreating into the mountains. Mercado found himself with a group of about 40 survivors, led by Captain Vicente Romero, a career officer who'd decided that surrender was not an option. They'd moved north into the more remote regions of Pangasinan and La Union, linking up with other remnant units and local resistance groups. The transition from conventional soldier to guerrilla had been jarring. Suddenly, there were no supply lines, no regular meals, no chain of command extending up to division and corps headquarters. They lived off the land, relied on sympathetic civilians for intelligence and support, and learned to avoid Japanese patrols rather than engage them. The weapons were a hodgepodge. Old Enfield rifles left over from the American colonial period, a few modern M1 Garands taken from battlefields, shotguns donated by farmers, even some Japanese weapons captured in small skirmishes. Ammunition was the constant limitation. The guerrillas hoarded every cartridge, fired only when absolutely necessary. A rifle was worthless without bullets, and bullets were impossible to manufacture in the jungle. Captain Romero established a strict protocol. No engagement unless the tactical advantage was overwhelming. No wasted shots. No unnecessary risks. This created a problem. The guerrillas needed to disrupt Japanese operations, needed to demonstrate that resistance continued, needed to maintain morale among the civilian population. But they couldn't afford sustained firefights. They needed methods of harassment that didn't consume their precious ammunition stores. Mercado had begun thinking about improvised explosives almost immediately. The concept wasn't new. Guerrillas throughout history had used homemade devices. But the specific challenge was creating something effective from the materials available in rural Philippines. The jungle provided organic materials in abundance, but conventional explosives required chemicals and components that were impossible to obtain. His first experiments had been disasters. He'd tried packing bamboo tubes with homemade black powder, a mixture of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter extracted from bat guano. But the bamboo tubes either split prematurely or failed to generate enough pressure to create a useful explosion. He'd tried wrapping the tubes in layers of abaca fiber to reinforce them, but that just made the devices heavy and unwieldy. The breakthrough came one afternoon while he was preparing coconuts for a meal. The guerrilla camp relied heavily on coconuts. The meat provided food, the water provided hydration. The shells could be used as bowls or cooking vessels. The husks could be processed into fiber. Mercado had been cracking shells, and he'd noticed how the shell fragments naturally fragmented into sharp, irregular pieces when struck with force. Coconut shells were tough, much tougher than most people realized. The fibrous structure could withstand significant pressure before failing. And when they did fail, they created exactly the kind of fragmentation that made for effective shrapnel. Better yet, coconut shells were everywhere, completely unremarkable, the kind of debris that littered any Philippine village. He'd taken the idea to Captain Romero, explaining the concept. Use half a coconut shell as a casing, pack it with gunpowder and scrap metal, add a simple fuse, and you had a hand grenade that could be manufactured from materials available in any rural area. Romero had been skeptical, but intrigued. "It sounds ridiculous," he'd said, "but ridiculous might be what we need. The Japanese expect rifles and mines and conventional weapons. They're not looking for coconuts." The other guerrillas had been less diplomatic. Sergeant Reyes, a former Philippine scout who'd served with the Americans for a decade, had openly mocked the idea. "We're not playing children's games," he'd said. "We're fighting a war. We need real weapons, not toys made from beach trash." Private Ocampo, who'd worked as a demolition specialist before the war, had been more technical in his dismissal. "The powder-to-weight ratio is all wrong," he'd argued. "You'd need at least 3 times as much explosive to get a useful blast radius, and the shell can't contain that kind of pressure. It'll just crack and fizzle." Mercado had nodded politely and continued his experiments too. He'd learned long ago that some people needed to see evidence before they'd believe anything outside their experience. So he'd focused on refinement, adjusting the powder mixture, testing different fused materials, experimenting with various types of shrapnel. He'd documented each test carefully, noting what worked and what failed. The key innovation had been the double shell technique. Instead of using a single coconut shell, he'd learned to nest a smaller shell inside a larger one, packing the space between them with powder and shrapnel. This created a containment vessel that could handle higher pressures while still fragmenting effectively when it detonated. The outer shell absorbed the initial expansion, creating a brief moment of pressurization before everything came apart. The fuses had required even more experimentation. Commercial fuses were unavailable, obviously, so Mercado had needed to develop alternatives from local materials. He'd tried cotton string soaked in saltpeter solution, but it burned inconsistently. He'd tried bamboo shavings packed into thin tubes, but they were too fragile for field use. Eventually, he'd settled on braided abaca fiber, the same material used for rope, soaked in kerosene and partially dried. The fiber burned at a predictable rate, could be cut to precise lengths to control timing, and was waterproof enough to remain functional in the humid jungle environment. By November 1940, Mercado had manufactured 47 coconut shell grenades, each one slightly refined from the previous version. He'd tested 12 of them in isolated jungle clearings, documenting blast radius, fragmentation pattern, and fuse reliability. The results were modest but consistent. Effective radius of about 3 meters, adequate fragmentation to cause casualties, or at minimum significant disorientation, fuse accuracy within 2 seconds of predicted burn time. Most importantly, the devices looked exactly like what they were, coconut shells. A Japanese patrol finding one wouldn't necessarily recognize it as a weapon until it detonated. That element of surprise, Mercado believed, could be tactically valuable. Not everyone agreed. The debate within the guerrilla unit had grown heated at times. Sergeant Reyes continued to advocate for more conventional approaches, save ammunition for carefully planned ambushes, focus on intelligence gathering, avoid unnecessary contact. Private Ocampo had conceded that the divinas worked in a technical sense, but questioned their practical utility. "Sure, you can make a small explosion," he'd said, "but what does that accomplish? You're not going to stop a patrol with a coconut. You'll just annoy them and bring down retaliation on whatever village is nearby." Captain Romero had maintained a carefully neutral position. He'd authorized Mercado to continue development, but hadn't integrated the devices into any operational plans. The guerrilla unit's standard tactics remained focused on small-scale ambushes, using conventional weapons, intelligence gathering for eventual American counteroffensives, and survival. The professional dismissal stung, though Mercado tried not to show it. He understood the logic. These men had training, experience, formal military education. Reyes had fought in actual battles, commanded soldiers, earned his rank through demonstrated competence. Ocampo had certifications in demolitions, understood explosive chemistry at a level Mercado couldn't match. They were professionals, and he was an amateur with some clever ideas about coconuts. But Mercado also understood something they didn't, something that came from years of working with his hands and observing natural materials. He understood that effectiveness and sophistication were not the same thing. A simple solution that worked reliably was better than a complex solution that worked perfectly, but required unavailable resources. The coconut grenades were simple. They could be manufactured by anyone with basic tools. The materials were abundant and completely innocent-looking. The technique could be taught in an afternoon. Those advantages might not matter in a conventional military context, but in guerrilla warfare, where sustainability and adaptability determined survival, simplicity was its own kind of sophistication. Mercado had kept these thoughts to himself. He'd continued his work quietly, manufacturing devices, refining techniques, waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate what he'd built. That opportunity arrived on December 17, 1943, when Captain Romero called an emergency meeting. The Allied supply drop had been planned for months, coordinated through radio communications with American submarine commanders operating off the coast of Luzon. The submarines couldn't surface in daylight. Japanese naval patrols and aircraft made that suicidal. But they could approach at night, launch small boats loaded with supplies, and retrieve them before dawn. The guerrillas had prepared a reception site on an isolated beach north of Sual, a stretch of coastline far enough from Japanese garrisons to minimize detection risk, but close enough to the guerrilla camps to allow rapid evacuation of the supplies inland. The operation had gone smoothly. The submarine had appeared on schedule, the boats had unloaded their cargo, and the guerrillas had hauled everything inland to a prepared cache site, a hidden location in dense jungle where the supplies could be stored until they could be distributed to various resistance units throughout the region. The cache represented 3 months of accumulated American support: rifle ammunition, medical supplies, radio batteries, canned food, boots, uniforms, water purification tablets. For a guerrilla force operating on the edge of sustainability, this was a strategic windfall. Distributed properly, these supplies could sustain operations through the dry season, allow the unit to expand recruitment, enable more aggressive harassment of Japanese positions. But the cache's value made it a catastrophic vulnerability. If the Japanese discovered it, they wouldn't just confiscate the supplies. They'd use the discovery to identify guerrilla supporters in nearby villages, intensify patrols, potentially force the entire resistance network in Pangasinan into premature collapse. The cache site had been chosen carefully. It sat in dense jungle 200 meters east of the coastal road, camouflaged beneath fallen logs and tropical vegetation, accessible only via narrow trails that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The guerrillas had been meticulous about operational security. Only 6 people knew the exact location, and all supplies were moved at night using routes that varied to avoid creating visible paths. But on the morning of December 17th, one of Captain Romero's scouts had reported troubling intelligence. A Japanese patrol had been observed operating unusually far north along the coastal road, conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of the area. The patrol wasn't following their normal pattern. Instead of staying on the main road and returning to garrison by noon, they were investigating side trails, checking abandoned buildings, examining areas that had previously been considered too remote to warrant attention. The scout couldn't determine what had triggered this change in Japanese behavior. Perhaps a villager had been questioned and revealed something under duress. Perhaps aerial reconnaissance had spotted something suspicious. Perhaps it was just random bad luck. A more aggressive patrol commander deciding to expand his operational area. Whatever the cause, the patrol's new route would bring them within 30 meters of the cache site by the following morning if they maintained their current pattern. Captain Romero had gathered his senior personnel, Sergeant Reyes, Private Ocampo, Lieutenant Santos, who handled intelligence, and Corporal Mercado, who'd been included primarily because his coconut grenades had become a running joke within the unit. "We have 3 options," Romero had said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the floor of the command hut. "First, we abandon the cache. Pack everything up tonight. Move it deeper into the jungle. That's safest, but also most difficult. We'd need 60 men working through the night, and the movement would create risks of its own. Second, we ambush the patrol. Hit them hard before they reach the cache site. Eliminate them completely. That requires good planning and probably costs us ammunition we can't spare, plus it guarantees Japanese retaliation. Third, we delay them somehow, make them stop, or divert before they reach the critical area, hopefully without revealing what we're protecting." Sergeant Reyes had advocated for the ambush. "We know their route, we know their strength. We can choose the ground. If we hit them properly, we can recover their weapons and ammunition, which offsets our expenditure. And if we eliminate them completely, no survivors to report back, the Japanese won't know exactly what happened or where." Private Ocampo had supported evacuation. "Moving the cache is low risk. Yes, it's labor-intensive, but we have the manpower. An ambush is unpredictable. We might take casualties, might not achieve complete elimination, might trigger a wider Japanese response." Lieutenant Santos had nodded thoughtfully. "The problem with an ambush is the follow-up. The Japanese will investigate when the patrol doesn't return. They'll send a stronger force, probably with armor support. Even if we win the initial engagement, we might lose the strategic advantage." The debate had continued for 20 minutes, each option analyzed from multiple angles. Captain Romero had listened carefully, asked probing questions, but made no immediate decision. Finally, he'd turned to Mercado, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner. "You've been manufacturing those coconut devices. Do you have any operational ready?" Mercado had felt the attention shift to him, felt the weight of skepticism in the room. "Yes, sir. 35 devices, tested and reliable." "Could they delay a patrol?" "Yes, sir. If placed correctly, they'd cause confusion and force a defensive response. The patrol would need to secure the area, check for additional devices, probably call for support. That could buy several hours, possibly longer." Sergeant Reyes had scoffed. "With respect, Corporal, we're talking about a 20-man patrol with automatic weapons. Your coconuts might startle them, but they won't stop them. The moment they realize it's just improvised devices, they'll continue their mission." Mercado had considered his response carefully. "The Japanese operate on doctrine, Sergeant. When they receive contact, they follow a specific protocol. Establish defensive positions, suppress enemy fire, call for support. The protocol doesn't distinguish between conventional and improvised devices. An explosion is an explosion. They'll react according to their training, at least initially. And when they discover it's just a boat builder's son throwing coconuts at them, by then they've lost forward momentum. They've shifted into defensive mode. They're focused on threat assessment rather than their original mission. That psychological shift matters. Romero had studied Mercado thoughtfully. How many devices would you need? One, sir. Properly placed. One coconut grenade to delay a reinforced Japanese patrol for several hours? Yes, sir. The silence in the room had been heavy with doubt. Lieutenant Santos had broken it. With respect, Captain, this seems optimistic. Even if the device works exactly as Corporal Mercado suggests, the delay would be temporary. The patrol would recover and continue. True, Mercado had acknowledged. But they'd be cautious. They'd advance more slowly. They'd check every meter of road. That slower advance might be enough to keep them away from the cache until nightfall, at which point they'd return to garrison. Tomorrow we'd have time to implement one of the other options, evacuation or ambush, under more controlled circumstances. Romero had made his decision quickly. Corporal Mercado, you'll execute this plan. Take one device and position yourself along the patrol's expected route. Your objective is delay, not engagement. Deploy the device to maximum effect, then retreat immediately to the secondary rally point. If the patrol continues toward the cache despite your effort, we'll implement Sergeant Reyes's ambush plan as fallback. Yes, sir. And Corporal, you'll execute this alone. I can't spare additional personnel for a diversionary action. And frankly, if this fails, I need the rest of the unit positioned for the ambush. Understood? Yes, sir. Sergeant Reyes had shaken his head. Captain, we're betting our most valuable cash on an unproven weapon designed by someone with no demolitions training. I strongly recommend. Your recommendation is noted, Sergeant, but we need to preserve ammunition and avoid unnecessary casualties if possible. Mercado's approach offers that. If it fails, we still have the ambush option. Prepare your team accordingly. The meeting had concluded, and Mercado had spent the rest of the day preparing. He'd selected his best coconut grenade, one he'd tested thoroughly, one with a fuse he trusted completely. He'd studied the coastal road, identifying the optimal placement location. He'd planned his approach route, his retreat route, his fallback positions, if things went wrong. And he'd ignored the whispers among the other guerrillas, the quiet conversations about the boat builder playing soldier, about Captain Romero wasting time on amateur tactics, about what would happen when the Japanese called Mercado's bluff. He'd learned long ago that proof mattered more than argument. Tomorrow morning, he'd provide the proof. Mercado had positioned himself in the irrigation ditch at 4:15 a.m., arriving well before the patrol's expected arrival. The pre-dawn darkness provided cover, and he'd used the time to examine every hole of the terrain, mentally rehearsing the sequence of actions he'd need to execute. The road ran roughly north-south, elevated slightly above the surrounding rice paddies to prevent flooding during the monsoon season. The irrigation ditches paralleled the road on both sides, perhaps half a meter deep, filled with a few centimeters of stagnant water. Dense stands of bamboo marked the field boundaries every 100 meters, providing visual reference points. Mercado had positioned himself at a bend in the road, a spot where the patrol would naturally slow slightly to navigate the curve. The geometry was important. He needed the device to land where the entire patrol could see it, where the explosion would be visible and threatening, without being immediately fatal. Too close, and he might actually kill someone, which would trigger a different kind of response. too far, and they might dismiss it as irrelevant. The waiting had been the hardest part. Alone in the darkness, listening to the insects and the distant sound of surf, Mercado had felt the weight of what he'd volunteered to do. The entire guerrilla strategy depended on his timing, his judgment, his ability to execute a technique that everyone except Captain Romero considered foolish. He'd gone over the plan repeatedly. Light the fuse, throw, retreat. Simple steps, but each one needed to be executed perfectly. The fuse timing was 8 seconds, which meant he needed to throw immediately after ignition. The trajectory needed to be flat. A high arc would give the patrol too much time to react and scatter before the device landed. The retreat needed to be fast but controlled. Running in panic would make noise and potentially reveal his position. When the patrol had finally appeared, Mercado had felt an odd sense of calm. The moment of decision had arrived, and all the preparation either mattered or it didn't. There was no more time for doubt. Now, crawling through the muddy paddies, he could hear the patrol behind him, still conducting their search. Voices called out in Japanese, questions probably, or reports on what they'd found. The tone suggested confusion rather than alarm, which was exactly what Mercado had hoped for. He reached a cluster of banana plants that provided better concealment and paused to listen. The patrol had definitely stopped advancing. He could hear them moving around the blast site, the distinctive sound of equipment being shifted, boots squelching in mud. Someone shouted what might have been a command, and the sound of movement changed, probably reorganizing their formation, preparing to continue their mission. But they weren't continuing yet. They were still in reactive mode, still processing what had happened. Mercado resumed his retreat, moving in short bursts, pausing frequently to listen. The sun had fully risen now, flooding the landscape with harsh tropical light. The temperature climbed rapidly, and within 15 minutes, he was sweating heavily, his shirt clinging to his back. He'd covered perhaps 800 meters when he heard the sound of engines, trucks, probably, coming from the south. Reinforcements, exactly as he'd predicted. The Japanese lieutenant had called for support, unwilling to continue the patrol, without knowing more about the threat he faced. The truck stopped near the blast site, and Mercado heard new voices, more activity. He imagined officers examining the evidence, questioning the patrol members, trying to understand what had happened. By the time he reached the secondary rally point, a small clearing 3 kilometers from the cache, it was past 6 o'clock a.m. Lieutenant Santos was waiting there with 2 scouts. "Report," Santos said immediately. Device deployed successfully at 4:48 a.m. Patrol stopped and went defensive. They called for reinforcements, which arrived approximately 40 minutes later. The cache should be secure for today at minimum. Santos nodded slowly. The captain wants a detailed debrief, but first, did they identify the device type? Yes, sir. I saw one of them holding a shell fragment. And their reaction? Confusion, primarily. They know it was a coconut shell, but they stopped anyway. They're treating the entire area as potentially hostile. A thin smile crossed Santos's face. Professional soldiers following doctrine, just as you predicted. Well done, Corporal. The immediate success of the coconut grenade deployment had strategic implications that extended beyond simply protecting the cache. Over the following weeks, Captain Romero's guerrilla unit began integrating Mercado's improvised devices into their operational doctrine. The Japanese patrol that had been stopped never resumed its systematic search of the coastal area. According to intelligence reports from sympathetic villagers, the patrol had spent 3 hours examining the blast site and surrounding terrain, eventually concluding that the area was too dangerous for routine reconnaissance. They'd reported encountering sophisticated guerrilla defensive positions and recommended that future operations in the region be conducted with full company strength and armor support. The irony was not lost on the guerrillas. A single coconut shell had transformed the Japanese perception of the area from pacified territory suitable for routine patrols to contested zone requiring significant force commitment. Captain Romero had authorized the manufacture of 200 additional devices. Mercado had trained 6 other guerrillas in the manufacturing technique, and within 2 weeks they'd established a small production operation. The devices were distributed to resistance cells throughout Pangasinan and La Union provinces, along with detailed instructions on tactical employment. The doctrine that emerged emphasized psychological impact over physical damage. The coconut grenades were not intended to replace conventional weapons, but to supplement them, to create confusion and delay at moments when confusion and delay mattered most. A patrol approaching a guerrilla position could be harassed with coconut grenades, forcing them to slow down, take cover, call for support, buying time for the guerrillas to retreat or reposition. A Japanese supply convoy could be attacked with dibinus thrown from concealment, creating the impression of a larger ambush force than actually existed. The Japanese struggled to develop effective countermeasures. The devices were too simple to jam or detect with conventional means. They looked exactly like coconuts, which meant soldiers couldn't simply shoot or avoid every coconut they encountered. The Philippine landscape was literally covered with millions of them. The fuses could be varied in length, making it impossible to predict detonation timing. The divias could be thrown, placed as static mines, or even rolled down hills toward approaching patrols. By February 1944, Japanese after-action reports from the Pangasinan region began referencing guerrilla explosive coconuts as a significant tactical concern. Some units began requiring engineering support for routine patrols, which strained Japanese resources and reduced their operational tempo. Other units developed elaborate coconut avoidance protocols, which meant they spent more time watching the ground than watching for actual threats. The psychological effect was cumulative. Japanese soldiers became warier, more nervous, less willing to treat any area as truly secure. The coconuts, ubiquitous, innocent, impossible to eliminate, became a symbol of the guerrilla's ability to turn the environment itself into a weapon. Sergeant Reyes, who had been among the most vocal skeptics, eventually admitted the value of Mercado's approach. "I still think it's ridiculous," he'd said one evening while cleaning his rifle. "But I can't argue with results. We've delayed 4 patrols, disrupted 2 supply convoys, and haven't fired a single rifle shot. The Japanese are committing resources to defend against coconuts. If someone had told me that in 1941, I would have called them insane." Private Ocampo had been more generous. "I underestimated the psychological dimension," he'd acknowledged. "I was thinking about blast radius and fragmentation patterns." "You were thinking about how people react under stress. That's a different kind of engineering." The other guerrillas had stopped making jokes. Mercado's coconut grenades had proven themselves in the only test that mattered: actual combat operations. The boat builder's son, with no formal military training, had developed a technique that professional soldiers and demolitions experts now studied and replicated. But Mercado himself remained focused on refinement. He continued experimenting with fused materials, testing different powder ratios, documenting what worked and what failed. He trained others patiently, emphasizing the importance of quality control and safety protocols. He stressed that the devices were tools, not magic. They worked because of careful preparation and tactical judgment, not because of any inherent superiority. In March 1944, an American submarine delivered a new load of supplies, including a case of actual grenades, proper military devices, with standardized fuses and reliable blast characteristics. Captain Romero offered them to Mercado first, in recognition of his contributions. Mercado had examined one of the grenades carefully, appreciating the precision engineering, the thoughtful design. Then he'd shaken his head. "Give them to Sergeant Reyes for the ambush teams, sir. They need the reliability for direct engagement. I'll stick with coconuts." "Why?" Romero had asked, genuinely curious. "Because I can make 100 coconut grenades with materials from any village. Because the Japanese expect conventional grenades but not improvised ones. Because simplicity scales better than sophistication when you're training farmers and fishermen to fight." Romero had nodded. "The right tool for the environment you're actually operating in, not the environment you wish you had." "Exactly, sir." By the summer of 1944, stories about Mercado and his coconut grenades had spread throughout the Philippine resistance network. The details grew more exaggerated with each retelling. Some versions had him stopping an entire battalion. Others claimed he could throw a coconut grenade 200 meters. Still others insisted he'd personally trained in explosive techniques with American specialists. Mercado found the mythology amusing but also concerning. The real story was simpler and more important than the legends. He'd observed a problem, developed a solution using available resources, tested it methodically, and proven it worked. That pattern, observation, development, testing, proof, could be applied to countless other challenges. The specific technique mattered less than the approach. He'd begun documenting everything, creating detailed manufacturing guides that could be copied and distributed. He'd developed training protocols that emphasized safety and quality control. He'd worked with other guerrillas to standardize components, so devices manufactured in different locations would have consistent performance characteristics. The Japanese, meanwhile, had developed their own mythology about the coconut bomber. Intelligence reports suggested they believed Mercado was either an American Special Forces operative or a Filipino officer trained in sabotage techniques by the U.S. Army. Some Japanese units offered rewards for information leading to his capture, describing him as a high-value target. The truth that he was a 26-year-old boat builder with no formal military education would have seemed impossible to them. Their doctrine didn't account for asymmetric warfare conducted by amateurs using improvised materials. They expected guerrilla forces to mirror conventional military structures, with specialists and trained personnel. The idea that significant tactical effects could be achieved by someone who'd learned explosive technique through trial and error contradicted their understanding of modern warfare. This institutional blindness became a strategic advantage for the resistance. The Japanese kept looking for a sophisticated organization that didn't exist, kept expecting conventional tactics from an unconventional enemy, kept trying to apply conventional countermeasures to unconventional problems. In August 1944, American forces landed at Leyte, beginning the liberation of the Philippines. The guerrilla units throughout Luzon intensified their operations, attacking Japanese supply lines, conducting reconnaissance for American commanders, preparing for the eventual arrival of conventional forces. Mercado's unit participated in dozens of operations during this period, using coconut grenades to harass Japanese retreats, delay reinforcements, protect Filipino civilians. The devices proved particularly effective in urban environments, where they could be thrown from buildings or concealed in rubble, creating ambiguous threats that forced Japanese units to slow their movements and commit resources to clearing operations. On October 12, 1944, Mercado participated in an operation to delay a Japanese column retreating from Lingayen Gulf toward mountain positions. The column included approximately 200 soldiers, a dozen trucks, and 2 light tanks. The guerrillas, numbering perhaps 40 fighters, couldn't hope to stop this force in direct combat. But they didn't need to stop them. They needed to delay them long enough for American air support to arrive. Mercado and 5 other guerrillas positioned themselves along the retreat route with 80 coconut grenades. They established firing positions in abandoned buildings overlooking the road, spacing themselves at 100-meter intervals. The plan was simple: create the impression of a sustained ambush without actually engaging in sustained combat. The Japanese column appeared at 2 p.m., moving at a steady pace, the trucks loaded with equipment and wounded soldiers. The lead tank swept the road ahead with its main gun, but the commander was clearly more concerned with speed than security. Mercado waited until the column was fully committed to the road section, then threw his first device. It landed 30 meters ahead of the lead tank, detonating with a sharp crack and a cloud of smoke. The tank immediately stopped, and the entire column halted behind it. 30 seconds later, another guerrilla threw a device from a different position. Then another, from yet another angle. The devices weren't coordinated. Each guerrilla operated independently, creating a pattern of random explosions that suggested multiple fire teams operating in the area. The Japanese reacted exactly as predicted. The column dispersed, soldiers taking cover, the tanks traversing their turrets to identify targets. The commander called for infantry to clear the buildings, and squads began moving forward cautiously. Mercado threw his second device, this time behind the column. The explosion suggested they were surrounded. Then a third, from still another angle, suggesting the guerrilla force was larger and better positioned than it actually was. The Japanese committed more forces to the clearing operation, sending entire platoons into the buildings to root out the guerrillas. But the guerrillas had already retreated through prepared escape routes, moving to secondary positions. The delay lasted 3 hours. By the time the Japanese commander determined that the threat was minimal and ordered the column to resume movement, American P-38 fighters had arrived, summoned by guerrilla radio operators. The fighters strafed the column, destroying most of the trucks and forcing the Japanese to abandon the road entirely. The operation cost the guerrillas 0 casualties and approximately 40 coconut grenades, materials that could be replaced within days. It delayed a significant Japanese force long enough to enable air support to inflict strategic damage. The tactical effectiveness per resource invested was extraordinary. Captain Romero formally commended Mercado in a written order distributed throughout the guerrilla network. Corporal Mercado's innovative approach to improvised munitions has proven invaluable to resistance operations. His coconut grenade technique represents the kind of creative problem-solving that will define successful guerrilla warfare. All units are encouraged to study and adapt his methods. The liberation of Pangasinan Province occurred in January 1945, when American forces swept north from Lingayen Gulf, supported by guerrilla units who provided intelligence and conducted screening operations. Mercado's unit linked up with the U.S. 37th Infantry Division on January 12th, transitioning from independent guerrilla operations to support roles for conventional forces. The American officers were fascinated by the coconut grenades. A captain from the division's ordnance section examined several devices, tested one under controlled conditions, and wrote a detailed report recommending the technique be documented and potentially adopted for other guerrilla operations throughout the Pacific Theater. "This is exactly the kind of innovation we need," the captain had said, watching a demonstration. "We're shipping millions of tons of equipment across the ocean, and you're making effective munitions from coconuts. The logistics savings alone justify documentation." Mercado had been interviewed by Army historians, asked to explain his development process, his testing methodology, his tactical employment doctrine. He'd done his best to answer honestly, emphasizing that the technique wasn't revolutionary. It was just careful observation applied to practical problems. "But that's the point," one historian had said. "Revolutionary isn't always complex. Sometimes it's just paying attention to what everyone else ignores." After the war, Mercado returned to Sual and resumed boat building. The business had survived the occupation, and his father, now in his 60s, welcomed him back. They rebuilt the workshop, re-established relationships with fishing families, gradually returned to the rhythms of peace. But Mercado's wartime experience had changed how he thought about his work. He approached boat building with the same methodical problem-solving he'd developed during the war, identifying problems, testing solutions, documenting what worked. He experimented with new hull designs, developed techniques for treating wood to resist rot, created training manuals so younger builders could learn efficiently. The Philippine government awarded him the Distinguished Conduct Star in 1947, recognizing his contributions to the resistance. The ceremony was small, held in Manila, attended primarily by other guerrilla veterans. Mercado accepted the medal, but declined requests to make speeches or give interviews. The work had mattered, not the recognition. Some of the other guerrillas stayed in military service, building careers in the armed forces of the Philippines. Sergeant Reyes became a lieutenant colonel, eventually commanding an infantry battalion. Private Ocampo worked in military demolitions training, teaching techniques to a new generation of soldiers. Captain Romero retired as a full colonel, serving in various administrative positions before settling into quiet retirement. They'd occasionally gather for reunions, sharing stories and reminiscing about the war years. At one such gathering in 1952, Reyes had raised a glass of rum and made a toast. "To Corporal Mercado, who taught us that professional soldiers don't always know everything, and that sometimes the best weapons are the ones you can make from beach trash." Everyone had laughed, but the laughter carried respect. They'd learned the lesson Mercado had tried to teach them during the war. Effectiveness mattered more than sophistication. Simplicity often beat complexity, and observation could be more valuable than formal education. Mercado had lived quietly in Sual for the rest of his life, building boats, training younger craftsmen, occasionally telling stories about the war to grandchildren who found it hard to believe their grandfather had once fought Japanese soldiers with coconuts. He'd passed away in 1983 at the age of 65, surrounded by family. The coconut grenade technique had outlived him. During the Hukbalahap Rebellion In the late 1940s, both sides used variations of Mercado's devices. During various insurgencies and conflicts throughout Southeast Asia in subsequent decades, guerrilla forces independently rediscovered or adapted the concept. American Special Forces manuals from the Vietnam War era included references to improvised coconut munitions, often without knowing the technique's origin. A few military historians studying Philippine guerrilla operations during World War II eventually documented Mercado's story, preserving it in archives and academic papers. But for most people, the story remained unknown, just one of thousands of small tactical innovations developed by anonymous soldiers trying to survive impossible situations. What made Alejandro Mercado's story significant wasn't the specific technique he developed. Improvised explosives had existed for centuries, and the coconut grenade was merely one variation among thousands. What mattered was the pattern of thinking he represented, the willingness to question assumptions, to experiment methodically, to value observation over credentials, to accept that simple solutions could be effective solutions. The Japanese military in World War II was one of the most professional fighting forces in history. They had excellent training, modern equipment, sophisticated doctrine, experienced officers. They should have been able to suppress scattered guerrilla forces equipped with improvised weapons and led by amateurs. But professionalism created blindness. The Japanese expected resistance to look a certain way, to employ certain techniques, to follow certain patterns. When faced with something outside those patterns, a boat builder throwing coconut shells, they struggled to develop effective responses. Their doctrine had no category for amateur with clever ideas, so they defaulted to treating every threat as if it came from trained military specialists. This institutional rigidity gave the guerrillas an asymmetric advantage. They didn't have better weapons or training, but they had adaptability. They could experiment, fail, learn, and iterate in ways that conventional military organizations couldn't. A formal military would need to submit Mercado's grenade design through layers of approval, conduct official testing, develop standardized manufacturing protocols, train personnel in approved techniques. The guerrillas just needed Mercado to show them how it worked and give them permission to try. In modern asymmetric conflicts, this pattern has repeated countless times. Insurgent forces develop improvised techniques that professional militaries initially dismiss as crude or ineffective, only to discover that crude and effective is often better than sophisticated and unavailable. The specific technologies change: drones, social media, 3D printed components. But the underlying dynamic remains constant. Mercado's story is ultimately about the value of paying attention. He noticed that coconut shells fragmented in useful ways. He noticed that Japanese patrols followed predictable patterns. He noticed that psychological effects could matter as much as physical damage. These weren't insights that required advanced education or specialized training. They required looking carefully at the world and thinking seriously about what he saw. That kind of observation remains undervalued in most institutional contexts. Organizations prefer credentials, certifications, formal expertise. They're uncomfortable with amateurs who've taught themselves through experimentation. They want solutions that fit established categories and validate existing hierarchies. But the world doesn't care about credentials. The Japanese patrol stopped because the coconut grenade worked, not because Mercado had the right certifications. The guerrilla operation succeeded because the technique was effective, not because it had been approved by experts. Years after the war, one of Mercado's former students, a fisherman who'd been trained in coconut grenade manufacturing and later became a successful boat builder himself, was asked what he'd learned from the experience. His answer was simple. Pay attention to what's actually in front of you, not what you think should be there. The solution is usually simpler than you expect, made from things you've been ignoring. That was Mercado's gift to the resistance. Not a specific weapon, but a way of thinking. Not a revolutionary technique, but permission to trust observation over doctrine. The cache Mercado protected on December 18, 1943, sustained guerrilla operations throughout the spring and summer of 1944. The supplies enabled dozens of successful operations, supported hundreds of fighters, contributed materially to the eventual liberation of Pangasinan. All because a boat builder noticed that coconut shells were tougher than people realized, and had the courage to act on what he'd noticed. The coastal road where Mercado deployed his first coconut grenade still exists, though it's paved now, lined with power lines and modern buildings. The rice paddies have mostly been converted to other uses: fish farms, industrial sites, housing developments. The acacia tree that marked the cache's perimeter died decades ago, replaced by a cell tower. Nothing remains to mark where the incident occurred. There's no monument, no historical marker, no indication that anything significant ever happened there. But in the archives of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, in place of yellowing documents and faded photographs, there's a file labeled Mercado, Alejandro C., Corporal, Philippine Commonwealth Army, Guerrilla Forces. The file contains his service record, his commendation, witness statements from fellow guerrillas, and a brief technical report on coconut grenade manufacturing techniques. One document stands out: a handwritten note from Captain Vicente Romero, written in 1946. Corporal Mercado represented everything that made our guerrilla force effective. He wasn't the best shot, wasn't the strongest fighter, didn't have the most military knowledge, but he had something more valuable. He paid attention. He noticed things others missed, thought carefully about what he noticed, and had the confidence to act on his conclusions. The coconut grenades were brilliant, not because they were powerful, but because they were possible. Any farmer, any fisherman, any villager could make them. That made them sustainable. That made them strategic. I learned more about leadership and innovation from watching Mercado work than I learned in 4 years of formal military education. His legacy isn't the grenades, it's the example. Look carefully, think clearly, act boldly. The note was never published, never widely distributed. It remained in Romero's personal files until his death, then migrated to the archives, where it waits for historians who might someday study the small tactical innovations that shaped the Pacific War. But the veterans remember. At their gatherings, when they share the stories about the war years, someone eventually mentions the coconut grenades, and the conversation turns to Mercado. They remember his quiet competence, his methodical approach, his refusal to be dismissed just because he lacked formal credentials. He never acted like he'd done anything special, one veteran recalled. He'd just shrug and say anyone could have figured it out if they'd paid attention. But that was the thing. Nobody else did pay attention. We were all looking for complicated solutions to our problems. He looked for simple ones, and simple worked. That's the real story of Alejandro Mercado and his coconut shell grenades. not a tale of dramatic heroism or revolutionary technology, but a quieter truth about the power of careful observation, methodical experimentation, and the courage to trust your own conclusions even when experts disagree. No one ever doubted him again. But more importantly, he showed an entire guerrilla force. That effectiveness didn't require sophistication, that innovation didn't require credentials, and that sometimes the best solution was literally lying on the ground, waiting for someone to notice it. His technique was simple, but his legend endures.